The sun had set hours ago, leaving only a thin, sullen glow to mark the horizon. A bitter wind blew across the ramparts of Storm's End, howling through the empty corridors and rattling shuttered windows. Torches sputtered in the courtyard, their light wavering against the thick stone walls. The fortress that had withstood countless sieges over the centuries felt different tonight. It was not an army of men massed outside its gates, no host of flesh and blood that might be cowed by show of force or bribed with gold. A deeper, more insidious chill permeated the air, one that seemed to creep into men's bones and make them question their very nature. At the heart of it all, Gendry Waters clutched his hammer tightly, eyes wide as he stared over the walls. He had heard the news, the rumors that came on terrified lips. The Night King was here. A trumpet sounded from somewhere below in the yard, a frantic, wavering call. The defenders of Storm's End had rallied as best they could, but no man in Westeros was truly prepared for an enemy like this. Gendry swallowed hard. He was only a bastard, a fact he'd known all his life, though he'd come to accept it with a certain resigned pride. Robert Baratheon's blood ran in his veins, but the name Waters marked him as ever an outsider, a product of his father's proclivities rather than any sanctioned union. He had once been content to live a blacksmith's life in King's Landing, forging armor and swords, never believing he might someday hold a key place in the defense of a fortress that had once been his father's seat. Yet here he was, sweat on his brow, hammer in hand, a worn breastplate strapped over a leather jerkin. Just behind him stood Edric Storm, half-brother if rumor were to be believed. Edric had grown up with a little more acknowledgement, a little more acceptance than Gendry, raised under the watchful eyes of stewards and maesters, but in the end, it hadn't changed the truth of his birth. He too was a bastard of Robert Baratheon, though he was sometimes called the Lucky One. The name did him little good now. His hands trembled as he clung to a sword, the polished steel glinting in the torchlight. Maya Stone was there as well, boots planted firmly on the ground, face streaked with grime. Her dark hair was tied into a messy braid, and she wore a grim countenance that suggested she would take no quarter from any foe, living or dead. They had been gathered along these walls, in these wards, told that an ancient horror marched upon them. Over the last weeks, travelers and ragged refugees had poured south along the Stormlands roads, telling tales of the dead rising in the night, of white-fleshed monsters whose eyes glowed blue as cold flames. At first, the lords of the Stormlands had scoffed. That's a northern folly, they said, myths the Starks used to scare children into finishing their chores. Only when ravens arrived with increasingly desperate pleas. Jon Snow's messages from the wall, the tales of the long night returned. Did they begin to worry? By then, it was too late to truly prepare. Too late to stock the castle with enough provisions for a long winter. Too late to call upon the crown for help. The crown had its own troubles. Queens and kings vying for the Iron Throne. Their armies locked in petty skirmishes. Little else mattered to them, or so it seemed. So the Stormlands stood alone in the path of the oncoming threat. And the threat had come swifter than anyone imagined. Gendry peered across the battlements, straining to see anything moving in the darkness. The wind carried an eerie hush that rose and fell, like 1,000 quiet moans just beyond his hearing. He glanced at Edric. "Can you see anything?" he asked, voice low. Edric shook his head, his knuckles taut on the hilt of his blade. "No, not yet." A heartbeat later, Maya stiffened. "Listen," she whispered. Another gust of wind swept the courtyard, and for an instant, the torches flickered so low that the courtyard was nearly plunged into darkness. In that stretch of blackness, Gendry heard what she must have heard. A strange, scraping sound, like nails against stone or ice cracking underfoot. It made his flesh crawl. Then came the first shriek. It tore across the night, a high-pitched wail that belonged to no living creature. The gates below heaved, as if struck by something massive. Another wail echoed from the far side. Shouts rang out, men hurried to the battlements. More torches flared, casting jagged shadows upon the walls. Gendry's heart pounded. He hoisted the hammer, the solid weight of it grounding him. He remembered, half a lifetime ago, forging arrowheads and horseshoes in an unremarkable smithy in Flea Bottom. He had never dreamed he might one day battle an army of the dead. Part of him wanted to turn and flee, but the other part knew that to flee was to die or worse. He had only this bastion, these thick walls raised in ages long past, and the meager handful of men and women willing to fight at his side. The second assault came as a thunderous crash. With splintered shouts became screams. Maya dashed for the stairs, yelling at Gendry and Edric to follow. They rushed with her, descending toward the courtyard where a cluster of soldiers had formed a ragged line near the shattered gates. The shouts were frantic. "Hold them! Hold the line!" But how could you hold the line against shadows and ice? Gendry saw figures moving just beyond the broken timbers. A shambling horde with eyes aglow. The undead poured in, pallid skin glistening in the torchlight, their limbs stiff with rigor but driven by unholy purpose. Edric muttered a curse and raised his sword. Gendry slammed his hammer against the ground, summoning what courage he had. Maya spat. "You are Robert's bastards, are you not? Then fight like Baratheons." A wight lunged at them, once a man of the Stormlands by the look of its tattered livery. Now its jaw hung loose, rotted flesh peeling from its cheeks. Its eyes burned with the hateful glow of the others. Gendry swung his hammer in a wide arc and felt it connect with bone. The creature's head snapped sideways, jaw-crunching. Yet it rose again, screeching through a ruined mouth. Edric leapt forward, sword glinting. He aimed a downward slash, severing the wight's arm at the elbow. Maya took advantage, driving a dagger into the ghoul's neck, though it only seemed to slow the creature. They had heard the stories. To truly destroy them, one needed fire or dragonglass or Valyrian steel. But Storm's End was not blessed with stockpiles of dragonglass. They did have a few barrels of wildfire left behind from some older conflict, stashed deep below in the armories, but no one knew quite where or how to use it safely. Fire was the best they had. All around, men brandished torches, thrusting them at wights. The courtyard was filled with the stench of burning flesh. But for every wight that fell, two more seemed to appear in its place. And above the howls of the dead rose an inhuman shriek that froze the blood in Gendry's veins. It was a shriek carried on the wind, echoing from the ramparts where just moments before Gendry had stood watch. He glanced upward, and there, perched upon the highest wall, he saw a figure with skin as pale as death, crowned in jagged ice. Its eyes were a piercing blue, and it stared down with a cruel curiosity. The Night King. Gendry had never believed the old tales. Like so many small folk, he had thought them fables. A hush settled upon the defenders who noticed that pale figure. Even the wights seemed to hold back, as though awaiting instruction. The Night King raised one hand, a ghastly motion that promised doom. Then an ear-splitting crack resounded through the fortress. Ice spread over the walls. The stones themselves seemed to frost over as though winter's heart had been unleashed. Torches sputtered and died in the sudden cold. Men cried out, dropping swords to clutch their ears or rub their freezing hands. The enchantment rolled through Storm's End, creeping along corridors, icing the stout ramparts that had repelled so many sieges, as though the very fortress had been struck by the heart of winter. Standing in the courtyard, Gendry felt the air twist around him. A shallow mist rose from the ground, coiling around the ankles of the living. Where it touched flesh, frost bloomed. He watched in horror as one of the soldiers near him stumbled, dropping to his knees. Before Gendry could reach him, the man's face turned white, lips cracking as ice took him. The soldier toppled, frozen solid. The gates crashed fully, letting in more of the dead. Panic broke across the courtyard. Some men and women fled to interior passageways, hoping to barricade themselves inside. Others swung their weapons with despairing fury, knowing they had only moments left. Gendry found himself shoved against a wall, Edric beside him, while Maya lashed out with her blade, cutting down a wight that neared them. The stench of decay and the smell of burning pitch almost overpowered Gendry's senses. He saw no chance of victory. Storm's End was falling more quickly than any would have imagined. He ducked under a flailing arm, hammered a wight in the ribs, then seized Edric by the shoulder. "We have to get inside," he shouted over the din. "We can't hold the yard." Maya's eyes flicked to the main keep. Frost clung to the archways, but they still stood intact. "There's a passageway in the undercellars," she shouted back, her voice hoarse. "We can use it to escape to the cliffs." She then batted aside another skeletal hand. "Are you sure?" Edric asked, panting. Maya nodded. "I overheard the stewards once. There's a hidden sally port near the cliffs, an old tunnel that leads beyond the fortress walls. If we hurry, we might reach it before the dead overrun everything. Gendry saw no other option. The courtyard was lost, whites pouring in from every direction. He jerked his head in agreement. Lead the way. They fled as chaos consumed the yard, edging along the walls, ducking as chunks of ice fell and shattered on the flagstones. Maya took them through a narrow postern door. Inside, the corridors were dark, lit only by the occasional torch. They stumbled over bodies, some half-frozen, some sliced apart, while their footfalls echoed on the stones. More screams sounded from distant halls, accompanied by the relentless scraping of the dead. Gendry tried not to look too closely at any face. They passed men he had drank with that very day, men full of bravado and talk of how Storm's End would never fall. Their eyes were now vacant, limbs contorted in death. That sight stole the breath from him. Yet onward they pressed, down twisting staircases, past storerooms and damp halls that reeked of mold. The deeper they descended, the colder it became, as though the gloom of the crypts had always harbored winter's breath. Maya drew a torch from a bracket and lit it with trembling fingers. She led them further still until they reached an ancient door bound in iron. Edric tried the latch and it held. "Step aside," Gendry said, hefting his hammer. A single blow splintered the aged wood near the lock. A second blow tore the door open, sending shards clattering across stone steps beyond. Maya's torchlight revealed a tunnel carved from the bedrock, the walls slick with moisture. A sour smell lingered like stagnant sea air. They ventured inside, hearing the rush of the surf far off in the dark. Storm's End perched upon the coast, its walls facing the wrathful sea. With a bit of luck, they might emerge on a craggy shoreline or a hidden cove from which they could slip away. No one knew precisely where to go next, but even the wild uncertainty of the outside world felt safer than the certain doom they had left behind. Every few steps, Gendry glanced back, half expecting to see whites bounding after them. But the corridor was empty. Only a chill wind followed, rustling the torch flame. The sounds of battle above began to fade, lost behind thick stone and the labyrinth of tunnels. Soon, all they heard was the wet drip of condensation and the echo of their own footsteps. Edric's ragged breathing filled the silence. Maya held the torch aloft, jaw set in determination. "We can't be the only ones to make it out," Edric whispered, his voice trembling. "Surely some others have found ways to hide or to escape." Gendry didn't reply. He feared the worst. The onslaught had happened so fast, like a wave of night washing over them. He remembered the stories of Harhome, of Eastwatch, of the massacre at the Fist of the First Men, told by the few who had survived such horrors. Yet to see it with his own eyes, to witness the unstoppable tide of death, there were no words for it. But Storm's End, that great fortress, had never fallen to a living foe. Tonight it fell to an enemy beyond all mortal comprehension. They continued along the tunnel until at last the air grew saltier and the roar of the sea became thunderous. Rounding a bend, they spotted moonlight filtering in from a fissure in the wall. The hole was partially collapsed, strewn with debris. Water dripped from the edges. Gendry picked his way over, testing the ground for stability, then carefully peeked through. He saw the sea below, crashing against jagged rocks. The air smelled briny and cold. A rocky ledge ran along the cliff face, leading around a bend. That was likely their path. It did not look inviting. Maya gave a weary laugh. "Well, I suppose it's better than going back." They squeezed through the gap, one at a time, until they stood on the ledge. The drop to the sea below was more than 50 feet, waves battering the rocks. Another 30 feet above them loomed the massive curtain wall of Storm's End, the oldest sections layered in centuries of sea salt. High above, a pale glow shone on the ramparts, blue flame, or frost, or some unholy radiance that spelled the fortress's doom. Even from here, Gendry heard faint screams, cut short by harsh echoes. He shivered. They crept along the ledge, pressing their bodies to the cliff. The path wound precariously around a corner, slick with algae. Edric slipped once, nearly plunging over the side. Gendry seized him by the collar, heaving him back. Finally, the ledge broadened, sloping downward into a narrow beach of sorts, a stony patch where the tide lapped softly. The three of them collapsed there, if only to catch their breath. Gendry looked back at the fortress. Darkness clung to the towers, but faint pulses of eerie light flickered in the upper windows. He pictured the Night King standing in the great hall, or the courtyard, or some rampart, surveying his conquest with lifeless calm. An ancient castle of House Baratheon had fallen. All the men and women inside were now either dead or soon to be, and those that died would be raised again in the service of that ice-crowned fiend. The thought made Gendry's skin crawl. He turned to the others. "We can't stay here. The whites might find a way down, or the sea might drown us if the tide rises." Maya nodded, eyes glassy. We have to keep moving. If the stormlands are overrun, we'll need to head north or west, away from the coast. Maybe there are still pockets of resistance out there. Edric wiped the sweat from his brow. North seems unwise, he said, then paused as he realized how absurd that statement was. The threat was rumored to have come from the far north, beyond the wall. But ironically, the only place Gendry had heard might stand a chance was Winterfell, thanks to the Starks. Jon Snow, who was rumored himself to be a bastard of Ned Stark, had rallied men from all corners of the realm. The man had tried to warn everyone of the coming threat, to unite them. The realm's leaders squabbled anyway. But perhaps Winterfell was the last stronghold of real hope. It's a long journey, Gendry said. And from everything I've heard, the White Walkers march south. But if Storm's End is gone, the dead might soon spread across all the Stormlands. We can't just vanish into the countryside. We'll be found eventually. Maya brushed a strand of hair from her eyes. Then we go north. If the rumors are true, maybe the king in the north, or Jon Snow, or whoever holds Winterfell now, might still be fighting. We have to warn them how quickly the dead moved here and how easily they brought the walls down. They'll need that knowledge if they want to stand a chance. Edric exhaled slowly, staring at the towering castle that had once been his father's seat of power. Though Robert Baratheon was gone, Storm's End was supposed to endure. It was hard to accept that it was lost in a single night. We'll go north, he agreed softly. We'll tell them what happened here. Gendry felt a measure of resolve settle within him. If the realm still had hope, it lay in uniting behind the North's warnings. At least, if they made it that far, they might find friends or allies. And maybe they would find a place in this world for bastards with nowhere else to go. They pressed on, following the narrow strip of beach as it curved westward. The moon cast shimmering light on the restless sea, and overhead the stars glimmered like ice chips. The wind that whispered across the waves was cold and merciless, a reminder that winter had well and truly arrived. With every step, they distanced themselves from Storm's End and the horror within, though each of them carried the fresh memory of the fortress's fall. None spoke of it much, there were no words to make sense of such devastation. Instead, they trudged onward, unsure of their final path but united by shared blood and a desperate sense of purpose. They walked until they could no longer see the castle, rounding a rocky outcropping and plunging into darkness. Eventually, the strip of beach disappeared, forcing them to climb a crumbling path that led to a small goat trail along the cliffs. The ground was uneven, strewn with rocks, but they pressed forward. When at last dawn broke, it rose in a swirl of sullen clouds. A thin, pale light spread across the coastline. They found themselves atop a series of rolling hills dotted with scraggly trees bent sideways by the perpetual sea wind. No sign of civilization presented itself, not even a fisherman's hut. They collapsed against an old boulder, each exhausted to the point of collapse. Gendry tore at the leather straps of his breastplate, wanting to breathe freely. Edric let his sword drop, resting the blade across his lap, while Maya rummaged through her pack. She had insisted on grabbing a small satchel in the midst of the chaos for some dried bread. They ate in silence, each lost in private thoughts. Gendry tried to keep his mind from returning to the screams, to the sight of that unstoppable wave of the dead, but he could not. We have to find a horse, he muttered at last, voice raspy with thirst. Or some supplies. We won't last long on foot with no food. Maya nodded, swallowing a bite of bread. We'll search for a farm. She rubbed her eyes. Gods, I wonder if any of the small folk have fled already. Edric gestured to the rolling hills and open farmland that stretched inland. We'll try that way, see if we can come across a village or holdfast. Maybe we can get directions or supplies. They set out again, following the rough semblance of a path that twisted between low shrubs. The morning sun brought little warmth and the wind seemed to whisper of doom. After an hour or so, they spotted a thin wisp of smoke rising behind a cluster of trees. Heartened, they quickened their pace, cresting a small ridge to reveal a modest farmstead nestled in a shallow valley. A single hut of daub and wattle stood among small fields. A rickety fence contained a few goats, bleating in the crisp morning air. Gendry looked at the others. Let me go first. I'll call out so we don't startle them. He descended the ridge, hammer resting across his broad shoulders, until he was within shouting distance of the hut. Hello, he called. We're travelers in need of aid. A moment passed, then the door cracked open. An older man appeared, bent with age, a threadbare cloak draped over his shoulders. He eyed Gendry with weary caution. Maya and Edric approached slowly. The old man's eyes flicked between them, noticing their weapons and battered appearance. What do you want? He asked in a thin voice. Gendry cleared his throat. Some water, if you can spare it. Maybe some bread. We don't have much to trade, but..." He glanced at Maya, who produced a small coin pouch. "We have a few coins," Gendry finished. The old man's gaze drifted past them, scanning the horizon. "Saw strange lights in the sky last night from the east. Heard them screams. Storm's End. I heard rumors of a siege." His voice shook. "Is it the Targaryen girl with her dragons? Or Lannisters come to punish us for something? What's happened?" The three bastards exchanged a grim look. Edric took a step forward. "It's not a mortal army. Storm's End has fallen to the dead." The old man took an involuntary step back, crossing himself. "What sort of devilry? We'll pay for what we take," Maya said gently, "and be on our way." After a tense pause, the old man nodded, edging aside to let them into the hut. Inside, the single room smelled of peat smoke and onions. A small fire burned in a stone hearth, over which hung a blackened pot of stew. Two goatskin cots lay against the far wall. A younger woman, perhaps the old man's daughter, huddled with two small children, eyeing the newcomers warily. The old man gestured at a bucket of water. "I've got stew and some bread left," he said. "Not much." "We're grateful," said Gendry, retrieving a small coin from Maya's pouch. He pressed it into the man's palm. "We only need enough for the road." The old man stared at the coin, unsure if it was worth letting them stay. But he relented, rummaging for wooden bowls, ladling out portions of watery stew. The children watched with wide eyes. Gendry eased himself onto a stool, hammered legs trembling from exhaustion. Maya and Edric sagged near the door. In hushed tones, they explained a little of what had happened at Storm's End. They were vague about their heritage, being bastards of Robert Baratheon, but they offered enough for the old man to grasp the danger. He listened, mouth set in grim lines. "If even Storm's End can't hold them, what chance do we have?" The younger woman whispered, clutching the children close. Maya spoke quietly. "We're heading north. Word is that Winterfell stands as a gathering point for those who'd fight the dead. You might do well to pack what you can and head west. Maybe you can find shelter in some town or city, or cross the sea to Essos if you can. I fear the dead will spread across all the Stormlands soon." The old man's eyes glistened. "Can't just leave my home," he trailed off, his voice breaking. In that moment, Gendry saw the heartbreak that would soon touch countless lives across Westeros. This was only the beginning of a war with no mercy, one that pitted the living against a tireless, unrelenting enemy. They finished the stew, offered another coin in thanks, and prepared to depart. The old man disappeared behind his hut, then returned leading a sway-backed mare. "She's old, but she can still walk," he said. "Take her if you must. Better than leaving her to the dead." Gendry hesitated. "You need her more than we do." The man shook his head. "I won't be fleeing. My legs ain't what they used to be, and my daughter's husband is gone. Taken by a fever last winter. We'll hunker down as best we can. Hope them dead don't come this far." He gave Gendry the rope. "Best of luck to you." Gendry muttered his thanks, feeling helpless. They left the farm behind, with the children peering out from around the door, eyes haunted by the unspoken horror that now loomed over the world. A wave of guilt coursed through Gendry. What good was it to keep going if every place they left was doomed? But to stay would ensure their own deaths. Perhaps if they reached Winterfell, they might help turn the tide somehow. If there was to be a last stand, better to be in the company of others who understood the gravity of the threat. They took turns riding the mare, though she was slow and weary. The rest walked at her side, leading her along faint roads. By midday, they came upon more signs of abandonment. An overturned cart with broken wheels, scattered crates of produce rotting in the sun. Hoof prints in the mud suggested a hurried exodus. The air felt heavier, as though the wind carried some dread presence. They pressed on, occasionally spotting distant farms or little hamlets, but the sight of them brought no relief. Many were deserted, doors smashed or left ajar, livestock roaming freely. Those who lived there had fled or disappeared. Once, They saw carrion birds circling overhead, drawn to something half-buried in a cornfield. They did not investigate. The specter of Storm's End was never far from their minds. Over the next 2 days, they made slow progress northward. At times, they slept in barns or abandoned holdfasts, wary of every strange sound in the night. Gendry often dreamt of the Night King's face, that expressionless visage crowned by ice. He awoke each morning drenched in sweat, half expecting to see whites pouring through the doors. But the nights were quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. On the 3rd day, as they traversed a winding road through a lightly wooded area, they heard the thunder of hooves. Maya froze, motioning for the others to take cover behind the trees. Peering out, Gendry saw a mounted party crest a small hill, perhaps a dozen riders. At first, he feared they might be bandits or worse, but then he glimpsed a banner. Even from a distance, he recognized the golden stag on black. House Baratheon. But House Baratheon had no rightful leader now, not truly. Tommen Baratheon was said to be king once, though rumor branded him a child of incest. Stannis had died in the north, or so they had heard. Renly had been slain by black sorcery long ago. The Stormlands had been in flux for years. So who rode with Baratheon banners now? Possibly knights or loyalists trying to rejoin Storm's End. Unaware that Storm's End had fallen, Maya exchanged glances with Gendry and Edric. "We can't let them ride to their deaths," she said. "We should warn them the castle is lost." Edric pressed his lips into a thin line. "Could be they won't believe us. Or they might be desperate to see it with their own eyes." Gendry inhaled slowly. "We have to try." They emerged from the trees and waved their arms. The riders spotted them almost at once, reining in their horses with a start. One of them shouted, and a pair of archers knocked arrows, drawing bows. A tall knight in partial armor urged his horse forward, calling out, "Halt! State your names." Gendry raised his hands. "We mean no harm. We come from Storm's End. The castle's been taken by the dead. Don't ride there, you'll find only death." Murmurs rippled through the riders. The knight pulled off his helmet, revealing a lined face and a patch of gray hair at his temples. "Taken by the dead? Are you drunk or mad?" Maya stepped forward. "We saw it happen. The Night King himself came. There's no one left alive in Storm's End but whites." The man's expression darkened. "That cannot be. The living dead are tall tales. We serve Lady Shira Errol, sworn to House Baratheon. We carry urgent letters for the Castellan of Storm's End." His words bristled with disbelief, though there was an undercurrent of unease. Edric stood straighter, as if summoning some hidden authority. "I am Edric Storm," he said. A wave of shock passed through the riders. Gendry suppressed a shiver. Edric was proclaiming his identity boldly. "I have Baratheon blood. Storm's End was my father's seat, and I swear to you, it has been taken by an army of the dead. My companions and I barely escaped with our lives. Return to Lady Shira and tell her to flee. The Stormlands are no longer safe." The riders exchanged uneasy glances. Some recognized the name Edric Storm. Whispers sprang up. The old knight looked from Edric to Gendry and Maya, noting their battered gear. He struggled to maintain composure. "If that's true, then we have nowhere to go. The rest of the Stormlands, they won't stand against an army that could take Storm's End so quickly. The seat of House Baratheon." "Come with us," Maya said, desperation creeping into her voice. "We head north to Winterfell, where they prepare for this threat. We can't fight it alone." One of the younger riders scoffed. "March all that way? We have obligations here. People to protect. The winter storms alone might kill us." The old knight exhaled slowly. Yet if Storm's End is truly overrun by these creatures, he stopped, almost unable to speak the words. "What choice do we have? Return to your Lady Errol and urge her to gather her small folk and flee west or north," Edric urged. "Riding to Storm's End is folly. If you go there, you'll only bolster the Night King's ranks once you fall." A heavy silence fell. Finally, the old knight nodded, as though the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. "I'll turn our party around. We'll see Lady Errol. We'll try to gather as many as we can, but I fear for those who refuse to believe us. Many will hold tight to their lands until it's too late." Gendry felt a pang of sorrow. "We can only warn them. It's up to them to decide." With that, the meeting concluded. The riders offered them a small bag of oats and a few strips of dried meat, then galloped away, their faces pale with fear and uncertainty. Gendry stood on the road, watching them vanish into the rolling hills, a swirl of dust in their wake. Edric's declaration still hung in the air. Edric Storm, bastard of Robert Baratheon, finally unveiling himself to men sworn to the Stag Banner. He had never sought to claim leadership, but now it seemed he might be forced into that role. They continued onward, following the winding roads as they curved around farmland and through sparse copses of trees. Each day felt colder, as though winter advanced with unnatural speed. The sky was perpetually gray, and the bitter wind gnawed at exposed skin. They slept fitfully in the wild, too afraid of encountering whites on the road to risk lighting large fires. Usually they huddled together for warmth, taking turns at watch. It was on the 7th day after the fall of Storm's End that they encountered the first refugees. A group of small folk, perhaps 30 in total, women, children, and old men, leading a few oxen-drawn carts piled high with meager belongings. Gendry and the others reached them on the King's Road, which was more a rutted path here in the Stormlands. The refugees looked exhausted, hungry, eyes hollow from fear. They told stories of a pale rider glimpsed at twilight, of whites shambling through farmland. No one knew exactly where to go. Some spoke of heading for King's Landing, but others claimed the capital was in chaos, rife with political turmoil and no real leadership to handle a crisis of this magnitude. Others insisted they should sail to Essos. But ships were scarce, and passage cost more than most would ever see in a lifetime. Gendry found himself giving the same advice over and over. Go north. If Winterfell still stands, that's our best hope. He felt like a fool repeating it, for all he knew, Winterfell might have fallen already. Still, the word had to spread. If there was any bastion left, it was the north. The White Walkers might eventually reach there too, but if so, better to face them alongside armies prepared for such a fight. At least a few families decided to head north, joining their makeshift group. The others parted ways, determined to try their luck elsewhere. Maya said nothing to dissuade them. Everyone had to choose their own path in this horror. She merely watched them go, eyes distant. Their small band grew slowly, more refugees joining as they traveled. Edric's name carried some weight, especially when he revealed who he was. Even the unacknowledged blood of Robert Baratheon was enough for some to trust his warnings. Gendry kept a lower profile. He was also a bastard of the same father, but he had spent most of his life in Flea Bottom and had no skill for leading. He watched Edric attempt to organize the frightened small folk, admired how Maya barked orders to keep them moving, and felt a strange mixture of pride and fear. They were stepping into roles fate had thrust upon them, whether they wanted them or not. The road north was not easy. Food grew scarcer. The nights turned colder. Once they found an entire village abandoned. Doors stood open, dogs wandered the streets, but no living soul remained. Some guessed they had fled. Others feared something had taken them in the night. No one lingered to find out. As they progressed deeper into the Stormlands, then into the Riverlands, the scale of the calamity became apparent. Burned farms, dead livestock, abandoned holdfasts, and always rumors. Rumors of walking corpses, of white-faced specters. Some travelers even spoke of monstrous undead beasts, though Gendry couldn't be sure if those stories were true or panic-fueled exaggerations. He kept remembering the unstoppable nature of that assault on Storm's End, how easily the Whites had scaled walls and broken gates. If there were indeed undead beasts, the realm stood on the precipice of true annihilation. Amidst these harsh realities, a quiet sense of camaraderie formed in the group. Maya helped teach the older children how to use a sling to hunt small game. Edric, to his own surprise, found himself mediating small disputes among the refugees, who should take which wagon, how to ration the remaining salted fish, whether they should risk a detour to a rumored storehouse. The authority he carried, even as a bastard, seemed to grant him a certain reluctant respect. Gendry tried to fix wagon wheels and shoe the handful of horses, using the blacksmith skills he once practiced in King's Landing. At night, around a small, discreet campfire, they would discuss rumors of the war in the south and the fragile alliances in the north. They spoke in hushed voices about Daenerys Targaryen, the Dragon Queen said to be in the midst of war. Some refugees claimed that she had turned her dragons against the Lannisters and burned entire armies. Others insisted she was the realm's only hope to fight the White Walkers. Then there was word of a queen in King's Landing, cunning and ruthless, who might either stand against the dead or attempt to broker some twisted deal. No one knew the truth. The only certainty was that the Night King's forces moved with silent efficiency, bringing an endless winter in their wake. One evening, they found a campsite beside a half-frozen stream. After ensuring the perimeter was secure, they allowed a small fire. Maya, Edric, and Gendry huddled around it, the meager flames casting their shadows against the bare trees. The rest of the refugees were spread out, trying to find shelter beneath thick blankets or leaning against the few wagons. And Al hooted somewhere in the darkness. "You think any of Father's other bastards survived?" Gendry asked quietly, staring into the fire. "I heard rumors of dozens more. Some folks always said Robert had a bastard in every village he passed through." Edric grimaced. "I don't know. Most of them never even had a name known to the lords. But if they did exist, maybe they're out there, running just like us. Or maybe they're already lost." He ran a hand over his face. "I don't like to dwell on it." Maya tossed a twig into the flames, watching it curl and burn. "We three are here by some mercy of the gods. That might be enough." She paused, a distant look in her eyes. "We're all that's left of House Baratheon in a sense. The realm never cared much for the bastards, but now maybe that's all that remains." Gendry felt a flicker of defiance. "Then we'll do something with it," he said. "If we reach the north, if Winterfell stands, maybe we can make a difference. Fight in Father's memory or fight for something bigger than all that. I don't know. But I'm not letting the dead take everything without a struggle." Maya smiled faintly. "I will fight." Edric nodded in silent agreement. The wind rustled through the bare branches, and for a moment Gendry thought he saw a pale shape moving in the darkness. His heart lurched, but it was only the moonlight on the snow. Sleep did not come easily, and the dreams of Storm's End's fall returned, more vivid than ever. Days blended into one another as they pressed farther north, crossing into the territories once riddled by the War of the Five Kings. They passed the ruins of camps long abandoned, the corpses of men and horses still unburied. Winter had come early. The usual trade caravans were absent, and the fields lay barren under a dusting of frost. Each night, the group seemed more haunted, as if the very air whispered with the memory of war. The bastards of Baratheon, though they never called themselves that, gained a reputation among the small folk they encountered. Some recognized Edric or had heard of him by rumor. Others simply saw three determined travelers leading a ragtag group of refugees. Word spread that Storm's End had fallen, which sowed panic among some but also spurred others to flee north. Their band soon became too large to move quickly. Disputes arose and they had fewer supplies. They tried to manage what they could, but it was clear that not everyone would endure this journey. Late one afternoon, they found themselves at the edge of a wide river. The rotted remnants of a bridge jutted from the banks, collapsed into the icy current below. To cross, they needed to build rafts or find a better crossing upstream. The refugees muttered anxiously. They had children and old folk who couldn't swim, and the water looked merciless. Maya scouted along the bank for a possible ford. Gendry and Edric helped gather driftwood, trying to piece together a makeshift raft. As the sun slid behind the clouds, painting the sky a dull gray, a horn blew from somewhere across the river. Everyone froze. Another horn blast followed, echoing across the water. Gendry scrambled to the riverbank, trying to see the source. The opposite shore was thick with trees, but he glimpsed shapes moving among them. Riders? Soldiers? He couldn't tell. Then he spotted a banner flickering in the wind. A dire wolf, gray on white. The Stark sigil. Relief flooded him. If that was truly a northern host or even a small scouting party, then perhaps they could offer guidance or help. "Who goes there?" came a shout from across the water. A man in dark leather stood at the edge of the trees, hand on his sword hilt. Beside him was a woman with thick auburn hair, holding a bow. They seemed cautious, though not openly hostile. Edric cupped his hands and called back, "Travelers from the Stormlands. Refugees and smallfolk. We seek passage north to Winterfell." A pause. The man exchanged words with someone behind him, then shouted, "We're riders in service to Lady Brienne of Tarth and King Jon Snow. The undead are advancing south. We've been sent to gather any survivors who will come north and fight." Gendry felt a wave of gratitude. If Lady Brienne of Tarth was working with Jon Snow, that meant the lines of communication were open between some parts of the south and the north. The man across the river signaled to others, and within moments, a small group of riders emerged, guiding a makeshift ferry, a large raft with ropes strung across the current, anchored on both shores. It looked sturdy enough to carry a handful of people at a time, maybe even a wagon or two, though it would require multiple trips. The crossing took hours. The men on the far bank helped haul the raft back and forth. Women and children went first, along with the most infirm. Horses and oxen had to be coaxed on carefully, braying in protest. Gendry, Edric, and Maya waited until most of the refugees had crossed. At last, when twilight was almost upon them, they guided the final wagon onto the raft. With a groan of ropes, they were ferried across the icy river. On the other side, they met the man who had hailed them, a grizzled scout named Peter, and the woman with the bow, a fierce-eyed archer called Orla. They introduced themselves as outriders for the forces loyal to Jon Snow, who was calling himself king in the north. "We've set up a staging camp half a day's ride from here," Peter explained. "Lady Brienne leads it, gathering refugees and training them as best she can to face the dead. Once we're strong enough, we march to Winterfell or wherever else we're needed." Maya let out a breath of relief. "Then take us there. We've seen the dead ourselves at Storm's End." She recounted, as briefly as she could, the fall of the fortress and their harrowing escape. The scouts listened in grim silence, the color draining from their faces. "Then it's worse than we feared," Orla said. "Winterfell has been bracing for an attack from the north, but if whites are already moving this far south..." Edric nodded. "It's bad. We should make haste." And so they did. With the scouts leading, they guided the refugees through dense woodlands, avoiding open roads where bandits or roving horrors might lurk. Everyone was exhausted, hungry, but a spark of hope flickered in them now. Maybe, just maybe, they had found an ally at last. Nightfall enveloped the land in deep shadows. They traversed narrow trails, the torches sputtering in the biting wind. Gendry tried to keep the weary mare moving, though she stumbled often. Finally, in the dark of the evening, they glimpsed firelight through the trees. A large clearing opened up before them, revealing a sprawling encampment. Tents clustered around a central cook fire, wagons parked in rows, and makeshift barricades erected at the perimeter. At least 100 people, maybe more, were settled there, some knights, some sellswords, many small folk. Peter blew a short note on his horn to signal their arrival. Figures emerged from the tents, some bearing arms. The sight of so many new arrivals caused a stir, but when Peter and Orla raised hands in greeting, the tension eased. A tall figure stepped forward, cloaked in heavy furs, sword at her side. Moonlight glinted off the hilt, and the flicker of torchlight revealed worn but polished armor. It was a woman with golden hair cut short, her face bearing both scars and an unyielding strength. Lady Brienne of Tarth. Her gaze swept over the ragged refugees, then fixed on Gendry, Edric, and Maya. Her broad shoulders seemed to tense, recognizing something in them. When she spoke, her voice was low and sure. "You've come from the south?" Edric nodded. "Storm's End is lost, my lady." For a moment, Brienne's face fell in heartbreak. Storm's End was near to Tarth, and House Baratheon had once been her lord. "All lost?" "Yes," Gendry said softly, feeling the weight of it again. "Everyone who stayed behind is either dead or worse." Brienne's hands clenched at her sides. Then she exhaled, steeling herself. "You're safe here," she told the refugees. "Gather around the fires, warm yourselves, and we'll find you tents." She turned back to the three bastards. "And you come with me. We have much to discuss. My lord, King Jon, must hear of this, and quickly." They followed her through the camp, weaving between clusters of weary folk and battered soldiers. There were men from the Riverlands, from the Vale, a few from the Reach, all come together under the banner of the Direwolf. Gendry heard snatches of conversation, talk of White Walkers, of dragons, of a final stand. It was chaos, but organized chaos shaped by purpose. Brienne led them to a larger tent at the rear of the encampment. Inside, a table was spread with maps, candles guttering in the cold. A few officers stood around, conferring in hushed voices. They looked up as the newcomers entered. Brienne introduced Gendry, Edric, and Maya quickly, explaining that they had survived the fall of Storm's End and were Baratheon bastards. A ripple of shock passed around the tent. An older man with a thick beard asked, "Are you certain the castle has fallen?" "Yes," Edric said. He glanced at Gendry, who gave a solemn nod. "The Night King came in the night." He faltered for a moment, remembering the screams, the taste of ash in the courtyard. "We barely escaped." "Gods preserve us," the man muttered. Brienne's joy tightened. "We're stretched thin as it is. King Jon is in the north, gathering every banner he can. The dead were expected from the north, not the south." She pressed a hand to her forehead. "We must get this news to him at once." Maya squared her shoulders. "We'll go. We're heading north anyway, and we need to speak with him. This threat won't stop with Storm's End." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Brienne looked at them, then inclined her head. "Your arrival changes everything. We cannot afford to remain here if the dead march from both directions. We must unify our forces. Tomorrow at first light, I'll send riders to gather the outposts we've set up nearby. We'll break camp and head for Winterfell. It's a long march, but we've no choice." Gendry felt a rush of mingled dread and relief. They would finally be moving closer to a place where true resistance was forming. But the knowledge that an army this size would be on the road, vulnerable to the elements, weighed heavily on him. At least they would not be alone in the wilderness anymore. Brienne studied the three of them for a long moment, her gaze lingering on Gendry's hammer. "Robert's bastards," she murmured, voice thick with memory. "Your father once called me Brienne the Beauty as a jest. I served under King Renly and have seen war enough for 10 lifetimes. I don't know if the blood in your veins will help you in this fight, but your spirit might. Will you stand with me?" Edric looked her in the eye. "We will." Maya and Gendry nodded. Brienne's lips curved into a sad smile. "Then rest now. Tomorrow we march at dawn. I have a feeling your part in this war is just beginning." They departed the tent, stepping back into the cold night. Around them, the camp buzzed with quiet activity. Refugees ate rations by the fires while soldiers sharpened swords or repaired armor. There was a sense of urgency in every movement, as though they all knew time was perilously short. Gendry turned his gaze to the sky. The moon was high, shrouded by a thin veil of clouds. A memory of the Night King perched on Storm's End's walls surfaced unbidden, sending a tremor through him. But here, in this camp, there was hope. They had found allies, a plan, a path forward. The realm might be broken, haunted by cold terror, but it was not yet defeated. Edric gently clapped Gendry on the shoulder, and Maya looped an arm through his, guiding him toward a cluster of tents where they could rest. Tomorrow, the next stage of their journey would begin. They would march north with Lady Brienne's ragged host, a convergence of survivors, bastards, knights, and small folk alike, all looking to face an enemy that defied mortal comprehension. And if they made it to Winterfell, they might join the Starks themselves, forging an alliance of ice and storm. Robert Baratheon's children would stand with Ned Stark's, bastards or not, to hold the living line against the coming darkness. Night fell deeper and a frigid wind swept across the encampment. Yet for the first time since the night Storm's End fell, Gendry felt a glimmer of warmth within himself, a fledgling sense that maybe, just maybe, they were not alone in this fight. If the living stood together, there was a chance. A small chance, but in the face of the undead, that was more precious than any crown. They woke the next morning to a sky of roiling gray. Dawn came sluggishly, a pale sheen of light over the dark silhouettes of leafless trees. A bone-chilling wind rustled through the camp, rattling tents and extinguishing weak fires. All around, men and women stirred from uneasy slumber to break down the makeshift camp on Brienne's orders. Gendry rubbed warmth into his arms and exhaled, watching the breath plume in front of his face. He could hardly believe they'd found an ally. Lady Brienne of Tarth, with her sturdy honor and fierce devotion, leading a force under King Jon's banner. For the first time since fleeing Storm's End, he felt the faintest glimmer of genuine hope. Edric Storm emerged from a nearby tent, cheeks reddened by the cold. He helped a pair of refugees load bedrolls onto a cart. Maya Stone stood nearby, stoically adjusting a strip of boiled leather across her torso, checking that her dagger was secured. Without ceremony, she nodded at Gendry. The two of them joined Edric in helping the refugees. Soon, crates were stacked, children tucked into wagons, and the line of march began to form under Brienne's direction. Lady Brienne herself, clad in partial plate and heavy fur cloak, rode up and down the lines on her warhorse, speaking quietly with her officers. Though her face remained stern, Gendry could see the compassion in her eyes as she watched over the ragtag band of small folk. Peter, the grizzled scout from the night before, urged them to keep pace. "We've stragglers enough," he warned. "If you lag behind, you're easy pickings for raiders, or worse, for whites." No one needed to be told twice. They felt the press of time in every breath. The camp broke at sunrise. The columns began trudging north, forging their own path through the riverlands. The roads were pitted with half-frozen mud, and pools of standing water had begun to glaze over with ice. Wagons lurched and groaned, sometimes requiring a dozen hands to push them free when wheels stuck in the mire. Horses slipped, men cursed, and the cold ate at all of them. Yet they pressed on, heads bowed against the cutting wind. Gendry found himself walking beside a wagon full of orphaned children, some no older than 7 or 8. They huddled under blankets, wide-eyed and silent, as though the terror of this war had robbed them of speech. It tore at his heart. He had been young when his mother died, never knowing his royal father. But at least he'd had a roof over his head in King's Landing, apprenticed to a blacksmith. He'd had some semblance of stability, meager as it was. These children had nothing but a cold road and uncertain tomorrows. He forced a small smile for them, tapping the side of the wagon as if to say everything would be fine. Their frightened eyes followed him, but they didn't smile back. The hours drew on, unrelenting. Around midday, the sky darkened with heavy clouds that spat icy rain. It drenched cloaks and seeped into boots, turning the ground slick. Maya trudged doggedly, her hair plastered to her forehead. She refused any offer of a spot in a wagon or on a horse, insisting that she would walk just as the common folk did. Edric did the same, though Gendry noticed how fatigue tugged at his features. This was not the measured, comfortable journey of a lord traveling with proper retinue. It was an exodus, and every league felt like 10. They made camp that evening in a copse of bare trees near a half-ruined holdfast. The walls were little more than tumbled stones, but they offered some shelter from the biting wind. Lady Brienne posted sentries and had her officers set up a larger perimeter. A few men constructed fires in shallow pits, shielding the flames with stones so the light would not shine too far. It was a risky move. Whites were known to be drawn by any sign of life. But the army needed warmth and hot food if they were to keep marching. And so the fires flickered in the gloom, pools of orange light that pushed back the encroaching dark. Edric, Gendry, and Maya found themselves clustered around one such fire, joined by Peter and Orla, the archer who had stood guard with him. The smell of stew drifted on the air, thin fare, mostly onions, and a few scraps of meat. Even so, Gendry's stomach growled. Hunger had become a dull ache inside him, something he tried not to think about. He cradled the wooden bowl in his hands, letting the steam warm his face. Brienne arrived on foot, her sword belt slung over one broad shoulder. Mud caked her boots, and the drizzle still clung to her short golden hair. She surveyed the group, then gave a small nod of greeting before seating herself on a broad rock near the fire. No one spoke for a moment. The flicker of flames revealed the weariness etched in Brienne's eyes. She had the look of someone carrying the weight of a kingdom on her shoulders. "How many in our company now?" Edric asked quietly, gazing at the mass of tents and wagons. "Over 200, Brienne replied. "More than half are smallfolk. The rest are soldiers or knights who answered King Jon's call or who fled battles in the south. We've a few from the Vale, some from the Reach, a handful from the Westerlands, a scattered bunch, but they have heart." She let out a tired breath. "We'll collect more as we go, I think. Some may leave us, but others will join. Our main goal is to reach Winterfell alive." "And then?" Gendry asked, not to challenge her, but because he needed to know. "King Jon and Lady Sansa have called banners from all over," Brienne answered. "We'll do what we must to defend the north and, if the rumors are true, to defend all the realms of men. Daenerys Targaryen still holds dragons, and she and Jon Snow have forged some sort of alliance. We're in an uneasy lull, but who can say how long it lasts? The Night King could strike anywhere." She paused, her expression darkening. "The fact he's already taken Storm's End bodes ill. If he's found a way to divide our forces to threaten from both ends, then the entire realm might be surrounded before we can unite." Silence settled over them. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night. Gendry's thoughts roved back to the last time he had seen a dragon, a distant glimpse of a winged shape crossing the sky over Blackwater Bay. He had never thought much about them, other than that they were symbols of Targaryen power from a bygone age. Now they might be the only weapons capable of matching the White Walker's dread. Maya broke the silence. "I want to stand with Jon Snow, if only to see a leader who truly understands this threat. While King's Landing squabbles, he's been preparing." She tossed the dregs of her stew into the fire, which hissed in protest. "We can't afford more dithering. Storm's End taught us that." Brienne nodded. "Aye, well said. The cost of inaction is too high." They finished their meager meal in thoughtful quiet. Then the group dispersed to fulfill tasks or find sleep. Gendry volunteered for a watch shift. He needed something to keep his mind occupied. The thought of slipping into sleep and likely reliving the horrors at Storm's End filled him with dread. Far easier to stand guard under the cold drizzle, scanning the darkness for signs of movement, than to face nightmares. The night passed uneventfully, though wind rattled branches overhead and made ghostly moans among the ruins. Gendry felt more unsettled by the quiet than he would have by a clear threat. He wondered where the Night King's forces were at that very moment. How many fresh corpses marched under those blue-lit eyes? He found himself praying, though he had never been much for the gods, that dawn would come swiftly. Eventually the sky lightened, and the camp roused again for another day of trudging north. Brienne led them deeper into the Riverlands, circumventing large towns for fear of encountering roving whites or desperate brigands. Occasionally they glimpsed columns of smoke on the horizon, but it was impossible to say if that signaled friend or foe. Once or twice, they encountered smaller bands of refugees heading south or east, each carrying their own desperate stories. Some joined the march, swelling the numbers even further. By the fifth day, they reached a crossroads near an abandoned inn. The sign creaked in the wind, old paint flaking from the wood. Gendry recognized the place from stories. The Crossroads Inn, often a hub for travelers from the north, the Vale, the Riverlands, and King's Landing. Now it stood silent, windows broken, as if the storms of war had passed through once more. The thatched roof on one wing had collapsed. Nevertheless, the place offered some shelter and the possibility of scavenging supplies. Brienne hesitated, then ordered a small detachment to search it, while the rest set up a perimeter. Gendry, Edric, and Maya volunteered to join the search party, which comprised a dozen men and women armed with swords, axes, or spears. Peter came along as well, crossbow in hand. Together, they approached the sagging door of the inn. A broken cart lay overturned in the courtyard, half buried in mud. A raven perched on the cart, cawing as they advanced. Edric pushed the door open with the hilt of his sword. The dim interior smelled of damp rot and old ashes. Tables and chairs lay scattered, some overturned, some broken. A stale hush hung in the air. Gendry's nerves prickled. Memories of Storm's End's collapsed corridors swarmed in his mind. He gripped his hammer, bracing himself for anything. They moved room by room. The main hall was empty except for debris. The kitchen was picked clean, no sacks of flour, no barrels of ale. The larder door hung ajar, showing only gnawed bones and scraps. Maya cursed softly under her breath. In an adjoining storage area, they found a single crate of dried beans, half-eaten by mice. Gendry cracked it open. The musty odor suggested it was still edible, just barely. They set it aside to bring back. Peter motioned to a narrow corridor. "I'll check the upstairs," he said. Maya offered to go with him. Gendry and Edric stayed on the ground floor, methodically sweeping each room. At first, they found nothing but broken furniture. Then, in a small side chamber, Gendry's nostrils flared. A foul stench permeated the place. Edric used the tip of his sword to push open the door. A body lay slumped in the far corner, half-rotted. From what remained of the clothing, it looked like a woman. Gendry stepped closer, noticing that her limbs were twisted at an unnatural angle. Likely she died weeks ago, from wounds or sickness. But there was no sign she had risen as a wight. A small mercy, perhaps. "Poor soul," Edric murmured, crossing himself. "She must have hidden here while the wars rolled past. Or maybe bandits raided." He swallowed hard, turning away. "We should burn her if we can. Otherwise, if the cold spreads enough." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. With the Night King's magic creeping ever southward, any corpse not burned risked being raised. Gendry nodded, lips pressed tight. As if summoned by that grim thought, a series of soft thumps sounded from overhead. Immediately both men tensed. They heard muffled shouts, Maya's voice urgent. Gendry darted into the corridor and raced up the rickety steps, Edric at his heels. On the second floor, they found a long hallway with a few doors on either side. Dust motes danced in the stale light. At the far end stood Maya, dagger drawn, staring into a chamber with her back half-turned to them. Peter stood next to her, crossbow raised. "Stay back," Maya hissed over her shoulder. Gendry crept closer, hammer in hand. He peered past Maya. Inside the room, a figure stood near a fireplace, a man, or what had once been a man. His skin hung in grayish folds. He wore the ragged remains of a tunic, and his eyes glowed that telltale icy blue. A white, dried flesh clung to its face, and patches of hair dangled from a half-rotten scalp. It regarded them with a silent, predatory stare. Behind it, two more forms slumped in the corner, also whites, albeit unmoving at the moment. Gendry saw them twitch, skeletal fingers scraping the floor. Maya slid sideways, her footstep eliciting a creak from the wooden plank. The white's head whipped around unnaturally, jaws parting in a silent snarl. Gendry realized it was not alone. Another shape stirred behind the door, hidden by shadows. Peter stepped to the threshold, crossbow aimed, but fear etched his features. Edric set his sword, exhaling in a controlled hiss. "We can't let them escape," he whispered. "They'll kill anyone in the inn. Or worse, spread the infection outside. Take them here," then Maya muttered. "Better than letting them roam." Before anyone could respond, the lead white lunged, staggering forward with a speed that belied its decaying limbs. Peter loosed a bolt that caught it in the shoulder, but it barely slowed. Gendry bellowed a warning and rushed in, hammer raised. He slammed the iron head into the White's chest, cracking ribs and sending it crashing against the fireplace. The impact scattered old ashes and half-burned wood. Sparks flew. Maya darted inside, slicing at the second White that lurched from the corner. Her dagger raked across its midsection, severing decayed flesh. Still it came on, arms clawing. Edric dove to intercept, sword flashing in the dimness. The steel bit through one of the White's forearms, leaving the hand to flop grotesquely on the floor. The severed limb continued to twitch, animated by whatever dark magic sustained it. From the corner, the third White rose, jaw open in a noiseless wail. Peter quickly reloaded his crossbow, but the movement took precious seconds. Gendry whirled, focusing on the creature he had knocked aside. It was pulling itself to its feet, ghastly blue eyes locked on him. He lashed out with his hammer again, aiming for its head. Bone and desiccated skin crunched under the blow, but the White still moved, skeletal hands scrabbling at his arms. Its nails dug into the leather of his jerkin. Gendry gritted his teeth, shoved it away, and shouted for a torch or flame. "Hold it!" Maya yelled, stamping her boot on the severed hand that crawled along the floor. Edric had pinned the second White against a dresser, ramming his blade through its torso. Yet it kept squirming, letting out an eerie hiss. The small, cramped room made the fight dangerously close quarters, and the stench was overwhelming. Peter finally fired another bolt, striking the third White in the throat. That sent it reeling backward. Maya seized her chance, sidestepping the flailing arms, then plunged her dagger into the White's skull. The creature sagged. Yet as they all knew, that alone might not end it unless the magic was fully severed. Gendry pressed the advantage on the first White, using his hammer to batter it down. He stomped on its spine, forcing it face first onto the hearthstones. It writhed, bones snapping in a hideous parody of life. With a grunt, Gendry swung the hammer in a deadly arc, crushing the thing's skull entirely. Bits of decayed matter spattered across the floor. A trembling hush followed as the White fell still, the blue glow fading from its eyes. Behind him, Edric wrenched his sword free, panting. The second White stopped moving once the blade was pulled. Maya jabbed the third for good measure. Silence returned except for their ragged breathing and the persistent patter of rain on the shattered roof overhead. Peter wiped sweat from his brow. We should burn them," he said in a shaky voice. "Before they rise again." They dragged the bodies, still and twisted, to the fireplace, piling old wood and debris. Maya found a half-full jar of lamp oil in a cupboard, which they poured over the corpses. Peter struck flint, and the flames took hold, devouring the dried flesh. Acrid smoke billowed, forcing the group to back away, coughing. When it was done, they searched the rest of the upper floor, but found no more Whites. In one room, they discovered old bed linens that could be fashioned into bandages, along with a jar of honey and a small cask of stale ale. It was little enough, but in times like these, every scrap mattered. Gendry and the others brought their findings downstairs. Brienne herself entered the inn when she heard the commotion, and they gave her a quick report. Her mouth flattened at the mention of the Whites. "They're everywhere," she said grimly. "How long before there are more? This is no longer a distant threat." She rubbed the bridge of her nose in frustration. "Still, at least we've salvaged something. Pass the word, we're resuming the march within the hour." The group left the crossroads in behind, continuing north. Each day, they advanced further into the Riverlands, but it was a land transformed by war and winter. Fields lay untended, rivers half-frozen. The road was all but deserted. Occasionally, they spotted ravens circling overhead. Once, a small band of armed men attempted to ambush them, likely bandits out of desperation, but Brienne's vanguard turned them away with minimal bloodshed. As the days lengthened into a fortnight, the refugees grew haggard. A few fell ill with fever, too weak to press on. Brienne made the difficult decision to leave behind some watchers with the sick, in the faint hope they might recover and catch up. It weighed heavily on her, but there was no other choice. Gendry, Edric, and Maya remained near the front, partly out of loyalty to Brienne, partly because they needed to see for themselves what lay ahead. The nights were bitter, the days little better. Sometimes Gendry imagined he still felt the warmth of a smithy's forge on his arms, that memory from King's Landing as fleeting as sunshine on a winter morning. At last, after weeks on the road, they reached the outskirts of what had once been the wide expanse of the twins' territory. Word came that Walder Frey was long dead, and the Freys had either scattered or sworn new loyalties. But the twins themselves, those two great castles on either side of the Green Fork, were a crucial crossing point. If the river was frozen or the bridge was held by an unfriendly force, the entire host might be stalled or forced into a dangerous detour. By now, the group had swelled to nearly 300 souls. Each day, more refugees joined. Brienne had begun organizing hunting teams, training volunteers to fight, and rationing supplies with an iron hand. Edric, Gendry, and Maya were often at the heart of such efforts, helping keep order and teaching what little they knew. They arrived at the southern bank of the Green Fork on a cold, clear morning. Sunlight gleamed off patches of ice along the river. In the distance, the twins stood imposing two grim towers facing each other across the water, linked by a fortified bridge. Gendry heard murmurs among the refugees, especially those who recalled the Red Wedding. A sense of foreboding hung over the place like a shroud. Brienne called a halt. Scouts reported that the Freys who remained had fled or bent the knee to the new powers in the north. One rumor suggested that the Tullus had retaken Riverrun and made peace with the Starks. Another whispered that the Brotherhood without banners roamed freely, giving what aid they could. The truth was uncertain. Either way, the twins appeared to be only lightly garrisoned by troops loyal to King Jon Snow. A welcome sight, if true. Peter and Orla rode forward with a flag of truce, returning soon after with confirmation a small company of Northmen indeed held the bridge, awaiting further orders from Winterfell. When Brienne led the main host across, the soldiers at the gatehouse seemed relieved rather than wary, throwing open the gates and ushering them through. Gendry was struck by how many of them bore the dire wolf sigil or the flayed man of House Bolton that had been defaced, replaced, or half-painted over. A sign of the North's turbulent recent history. In the courtyard of the Eastern Tower, they dismounted or parked wagons under the soldiers' direction. A handful of officers approached, men with thick northern accents and no shortage of scars. Their leader introduced himself as Ronald Slate, sworn to House Stark. He bowed stiffly to Brienne, then to Edric, Maya, and Gendry when he learned of their lineage. Clearly the name Baratheon still carried weight, bastard or not. King Jon is at Winterfell, Ronald explained. He sent small garrisons to hold strategic points, the twins included, and to gather any refugees heading north. You'll find the place crowded, but we'll help how we can. We've got enough provisions to share for a few days, though we can't stay here indefinitely. Our orders are to protect this crossing until we're recalled. Brienne nodded. We won't linger long. Just enough time to rest, gather fresh supplies, and see that our sick and wounded receive attention. Then we'll continue to Winterfell. Ronald hesitated. You should know, the roads beyond here are uncertain. The White Walkers haven't come this far south yet, but we've had scattered sightings of whites. And farther north, near Moat Cailin, there's talk of entire swathes of land going silent. No travelers, no ravens. Brienne's mouth set in a grim line. We'll be on our guard. That night, they bivouacked around the base of the twins' eastern tower. The soldiers there offered salted fish, hard bread, and some oatcakes. Compared to the foraged scraps they'd been living on, it was a feast. Gendry ate until his belly ached, grateful for even these simple rations. The children in their party devoured the food with wide-eyed hunger, and for once, the camp was alive with low murmurs of cautious relief. After eating, Gendry, Maya, and Edric stood by the parapet overlooking the moonlit river. The water looked black and sluggish, chunks of ice drifting on its surface. In the distance, the silhouettes of farmland stretched away, cloaked in frost. Gendry felt a pang, remembering how lush the fields of the Riverlands had once been. Edric's gaze fell on the northern horizon. We're almost there, he said quietly, as if to reassure himself. A few more weeks of travel and we'll be at Winterfell. Maya sighed, leaning against the stone battlement. And then the Real fight begins. Gendry nodded in agreement. The fall of Storm's End had been swift and merciless. They had no illusions that Winterfell would be easy to defend if the dead attacked in force. But at least in the north, they would join a concentrated effort, a chance to hold the line with thousands of others. A chance, however slim, to push back the long night. They spent 2 nights at the twins, distributing supplies and letting the exhausted refugees rest. Ronald Slate's men helped with repairs to wagons, forging new shoes for horses. Gendry pitched in, grateful to use a proper forge for a change. Edric worked alongside him, learning quickly how to heat and shape the iron. Maya showed children how to weave simple nets from leftover rope so they could catch fish once they set out again. Brienne used the respite to speak at length with Ronald's officers, exchanging news of other holdfasts in the area. The biggest blow to morale was learning that travelers from the Neck had reported partial flooding and freezing, making certain bog roads impassable. If Moat Cailin was compromised, that left a single clear route to Winterfell, dangerously exposed if the enemy chose to strike. Nonetheless, when the time came, they set off once more. Their company had grown again, as a few families from the twins decided to join, hoping for better protection with a larger host. The cold was sharp, but the sky was clear. offering them easier travel across the next stretch of land. They pushed north with renewed determination. By now, nearly a month had passed since the fall of Storm's End. Gendry often wondered how far the Night King's forces had spread. Though word traveled slowly, occasionally they heard fresh rumors. That King's Landing was embroiled in yet more politicking, that the Iron Islands had pulled their ships away from the coasts, that Dorne had closed its borders to any refugees who could not pay. It all felt unreal, overshadowed by the knowledge that an unstoppable army of the dead was on the move. The first real sign of trouble came when they reached a small northern outpost near the marshes that marked the southern edge of the neck. Smoke rose from the outpost's watchtower, not the gentle smoke of a hearth, but thick black plumes. They found the gates torn open and bodies strewn across the yard, half buried in ash. Some were men in northern cloaks, others wore ragged southern attire. All were dead, faces contorted in terror. Brienne led a group of soldiers inside the walls. Gendry, Maya, and Edric came too, hearts pounding. The stench of charred flesh clung to the air. Some of the wooden buildings had been set ablaze, but it was unclear by whom. Gendry wondered if wildfire might have been used. A hint of chemical tang lingered. Scorch marks marred the stone. In the courtyard, they discovered white remains, twisted bodies scorched by intense heat. One soldier poked a burned corpse with a spear. It crumbled into blackened fragments. A few steps away lay a man with a shattered skull, burned beyond recognition. The watchers exchanged horrified looks. It seemed some desperate battle had taken place here. Brienne knelt by the corpse of a young woman dressed in northern garb. She was missing an arm. The knight placed a hand gently on the woman's scorched hair. "They were overwhelmed," Brienne murmured. "But how did the fire start?" Edric touched a patch of charred ground. Could have been a lantern igniting barrels of pitch or something else. They might have tried to burn the whites along with themselves. His voice shook with anger and sorrow. They must have known there was no escape. Gendry's gaze traveled across the courtyard. He spied a half-collapsed stable. The timbers were blackened, still smoking. Beneath the rubble, something moved. He tensed, lifting his hammer, and edged closer. Smoke stung his eyes. Carefully, he hooked a piece of debris with the hammer's head and pulled it aside. A man lay there, pinned by a broken beam, his face streaked with soot and blood. His skin was still pink with life, though he barely clung to consciousness. Gendry sucked in a breath. "There's someone alive here," he shouted. Brienne hurried over with several soldiers. They heaved the beam aside, revealing the man's battered form. His leg was twisted beneath him, likely broken. A thick scorch mark ran along one side of his torso, but he still breathed. Maya knelt, pressing 2 fingers to his neck. "He's alive," she confirmed. "But just barely." The man's eyes fluttered open, trying to focus. He coughed, grimacing in pain. Brienne tried to speak to him gently. "What happened here? Can you tell us?" He coughed again, spitting out black phlegm. His voice was barely audible. "They came in the night, whites, so many. We had no choice. We lit the pitch," a ragged gasp tore from his throat. "Burned them all, tried to hold them off, but some got inside." Maya looked stricken. "Rest, you're safe now." A faint, bitter laugh escaped him, a haunting sound. "Safe," he shook his head, tears cutting channels through the soot on his cheeks. "They took my wife," she turned. "I had to," his voice cracked, and he buried his face in trembling hands. The rest was lost to choked sobs. Brienne steeled herself. "Get the maester's kit," she told a nearby soldier. "See if we can splint his leg, treat those burns. He might survive the journey north if we're careful." 2 men lifted the wounded survivor gently, carrying him out of the rubble. Behind them, the rest began gathering the bodies, though time was too short for a proper burial. Under Brienne's orders, they stacked the dead in a pyre. Some were already partially burned, but they had to be certain none would rise. Smoke soon billowed again, and Gendry felt the heat of the flames on his face. It reminded him of that moment in the upper room of the inn when he'd set fire to the whites. Once fire had been his ally in forging steel. Now it was a desperate shield against the undead. Shaken, they pressed on the next day. The wounded survivor remained delirious, sometimes screaming in the night. Maester Selves did little to soothe his burns. He spoke only in half-formed pleas, warning of the dead that swept through the outpost. Yet Brienne gleaned a crucial piece of information. The whites seemed to come from the east, bypassing certain routes, moving as if guided by a precise intelligence. That suggested the Night King's forces were indeed branching out across the continent, probing weaknesses. The land grew boggier as they neared the neck. Winter had frozen many of the marshy patches, but it was still treacherous going. One wagon broke an axle crossing a half-frozen stream, plunging its cargo into the icy water. They salvaged what they could, but lost a barrel of grain in the process. Morale dipped and the cold never ceased its assault. Yet the group pressed on. The alternative was to turn back, which promised only doom. Finally, after countless days of struggle, the towers of Moat Cailin came into sight, rising like dark sentinels on the horizon. Once the key fortress guarding the gateway to the north, Moat Cailin was a ruin now, its walls collapsed ages ago, a scattering of broken towers on a low ridge. But the causeway that passed through the swamps was still one of the only safe routes north. If that path was blocked or overtaken, Gendry and the others would face a detour of hundreds of miles across even more perilous terrain. They approached warily. Brienne sent forward scouts. When they returned, their expressions were grim. Many of the old fortifications were deserted. A chill deeper than winter itself clung to the stones. They found fresh corpses, partially frozen, suggesting something terrible had happened in the last week or two. Some wore Stark badges, while others had no markings at all. Worse, the scouts spotted tracks leading away as though a large group had fled north in haste or been taken. Brienne's face tightened with resolve. She ordered a small contingent to hold Moat Cailin's gateway if they could, just long enough for the refugees to pass through. Then they would destroy or block the crossing behind them in case whites came from the south. It was a dangerous gamble, but one that might buy time for the main host to reach Winterfell. Edric, Gendry, and Maya volunteered for the rearguard, though Brienne insisted they keep moving with the refugees. "I need you three at Winterfell," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "You saw firsthand how easily Storm's End fell. King Jon and Lady Sansa must hear every detail. And the men here can manage. They have archers, spears, and the advantage of higher ground on the approach." It felt cruel to leave behind brave souls in a place so forlorn, but they had to trust Brienne's judgment. With heavy hearts, the column advanced, passing beneath the shattered towers. A bitter wind whistled through the broken stones. Gendry heard crows cawing. One wing of the fortress had caved in entirely, revealing a ragged hole open to the sky. The blackened remnants of a campfire lay in the courtyard, as if soldiers had tried to make a stand here. Edric's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword, knuckles white. Maya set her jaw. They kept the wagons moving. Brienne conferred with the soldiers who would remain, giving them final instructions. Once the last wagon crossed, the rearguard would set fire to debris piled across the narrow causeway, hindering pursuit. The plan was desperate, but what in these times wasn't? At dusk, the last of the refugees cleared Moat Cailin. Brienne looked back, eyes filled with silent sorrow, then faced forward. The north lay ahead, though still many leagues distant was Winterfell. The next stretch of the journey would test them further. The land was colder, the storms harsher, and nights longer. But if they could reach Winterfell, they might stand with thousands of others and with the king in the north himself to prepare for the onslaught. The days that followed blurred into a grueling trek across frozen plains and snow-clad hills. The sky often stayed gray, snow drifting down in gentle flakes that turned to driving sleet by nightfall. Some of the refugees had never seen snow before. They cursed and shivered, bundling in whatever cloth or furs they could scavenge. Food ran low again, forcing short rations. Hunting parties sometimes brought back skinny hares or a few pheasants. It was never enough. A few desperate souls attempted to gather edible lichens or strip bark from pine trees. Illness spread among the weakest. Still, they continued north. Brienne's presence kept the group united. Edric discovered a growing respect for her leadership. The knight never hesitated to share the burdens, patrolling the perimeter on foot, helping push wagons, standing watch through the night. Gendry admired her tireless resolve. Maya, too, found a kinship in Brienne's quiet determination. The three Baratheon bastards often took turns encouraging the refugees, telling stories of Storm's End or the feats of knights they'd heard of. Anything to keep spirits from collapsing into despair. At last, on a cold, clear morning, they glimpsed smoke on the horizon, thick pillars rising from beyond a ridge. Word spread through the ranks that Winterfell was near. A murmur of relief and fear swept the refugees. They were close to the seat of House Stark, but would they find it standing strong or under siege? Soon, they crested a rise, and the sight of Winterfell greeted them. The castle's tall towers and ancient walls loomed against the pale sky. Smoke curled from numerous chimneys, a sign of many hearths burning. Banners whipped in the wind, dire wolf flags mostly, but Gendry thought he could see other sigils too. Figures moved along the battlements. It looked as though an army had gathered. Rows of tents spread across the fields outside the walls, along with wooden fortifications. A horn call echoed. Riders approached, cloaked in fur and armed with spears. At their head was a woman with fierce gray eyes, wearing a cloak trimmed in wolf's fur. She reined in her horse and addressed Brienne by name. Brienne bowed from the saddle, though awkwardly. "Lady Lyanna Mormont," Brienne said quietly to the others. "A formidable young leader from Bear Island." Then she raised her voice, addressing the riders. "We come from the south, with refugees and soldiers loyal to King Jon Snow. Is Winterfell still under his command?" Lyanna Mormont nodded curtly. "It is. We've been preparing for the Night King's assault. You've come in time, perhaps, to lend your swords. King Jon is inside. He'll want to hear your tidings." Brienne exhaled, relief palpable. "Then open your gates, my lady. Our people are cold and hungry. We stand ready to serve." Lyanna signaled for the riders to escort the group. They moved closer to Winterfell's walls, passing trenches and sharpened stakes that had been erected for defense. Soldiers walked the ramparts in thick cloaks, their breath steaming in the chill air. They exchanged curious looks at the newcomers. The gates groaned open, allowing the slow stream of refugees to enter the courtyard. Gendry noticed the watchful faces of northern men and women, some with flinty eyes, others with a flicker of empathy. Within the outer ward, tents and shelters crowded the space. The stables were full, so wagons had to be parked wherever there was room. Stable hands took horses, though they had little fodder to spare. The newcomers were directed to certain areas where communal fires burned. As the refugees spilled into the yard, a wave of commotion rose, voices echoing against the high stone walls. Soon, another figure appeared at the top of the steps leading into Winterfell's great hall. A tall man dressed in black and gray, cloak trimmed with direwolf fur, sword at his hip. His hair was dark, shot with strands of silver at the temples, and his eyes held a quiet gravity. Gendry recognized him at once. Jon Snow, the bastard of Ned Stark turned king in the north. Beside him stood a red-haired woman, regal in bearing, likely Lady Sansa Stark, if the rumors were true, and with them 2 others. A diminutive young woman with dark hair tied back, scanning the arrivals with sharp eyes, and a stocky man with broad shoulders and a heavy cloak pinned by a Targaryen sigil, possibly a knight of Daenerys Targaryen's retinue. Brienne dismounted and approached on foot, bowing her head to Jon Snow. "Your Grace," she said in a respectful tone, "I bring you refugees from the Stormlands, Riverlands, and beyond, all seeking sanctuary and prepared to fight against the Night King. We also bring grim news." She gestured for Gendry, Edric, and Maya to step forward. "These 3 will tell you themselves. Storm's End has fallen." A ripple of shock went through the onlookers, and Jon's face hardened. Sansa's expression flickered from curiosity to alarm. The dark-haired young woman set her jaw while the man with the Targaryen pin breathed in sharply. Jon Snow gazed upon the 3 bastards as they halted before him. "Is it true?" Jon asked, voice quiet but firm. Storm's End was considered impenetrable. Gendry nodded, meeting Jon's gaze. There was a kinship in that moment, 2 bastards face to face, each carrying burdens that transcended their birth. "The Night King came with an army of the dead," Gendry said, forcing the words past the tightness in his throat. "We fought as best we could, but the castle fell quickly. We barely escaped." He swallowed. "I'm Gendry Waters, this is Maya Stone, and this is Edric Storm, all bastards of Robert Baratheon. We've come to warn you and to stand with you." A murmur rustled through the courtyard, 3 Baratheon bastards, each confirming the fall of their father's ancestral seat. Jon Snow's mouth set in a grim line. Sansa's hand flew to her lips, horror etched in her eyes. The dark-haired girl, Arya Stark, Gendry realized, looked between them, her expression flickering with a surprising intensity when she heard Gendry's name. After a heartbeat of shock, Jon set a hand on Gendry's shoulder. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said softly. "All of Westeros has lost something precious tonight." Then his tone shifted to one of resolute command. "But you are welcome here. All of you." He raised his voice to address the assembled crowd. "Winterfell will give what shelter it can, and together we will prepare to face the Night King's forces. The war for the living is upon us, we must unite or die." A chorus of voices rose, some cheering, some praying. Soldiers hammered the butts of their spears on the ground. The sense of tension was palpable, yet beneath it, Gendry felt an undercurrent of unity. Here, in Winterfell, the king recognized them not as bastards or southerners, but as allies in a war that threatened all. Sansa stepped forward, speaking to Brienne in a low tone, though Gendry caught a few words, references to lodging the refugees in the expanded camps outside the walls, ensuring supplies were stretched. Arya watched Gendry closely, and he felt a strange mix of familiarity and awkwardness. They had met, long ago, under dire circumstances, traveling with a ragtag group. He nearly spoke to her, but she slipped away, following Sansa into the hall. Maya and Edric exchanged glances at the swirl of activity around them. Jon gestured for the three of them to follow him inside. Past the great doors, the hall was alive with the warmth of braziers, tapestries on the walls, and the bustle of lords, knights, and northern folk. The scent of roasted turnips and steaming soup hung in the air, a welcome change from the perpetual odor of fear and ash they'd endured on the road. Edric couldn't contain a sigh of relief as warmth washed over him. Maya shivered, letting her cloak drip on the stone floor. Gendry took in the high rafters and flickering torches, glimpses of House Stark's banners overhead. This was a castle steeped in history. Once, the Starks had ruled the North uncontested. Now they led a coalition that stretched across the remains of a fractured realm. Yet the threat they all faced was beyond anything in living memory. Jon Snow wasted no time. He ushered them to a table where Sansa waited, along with the man bearing the Targaryen pin, who introduced himself as Ser Jorah Mormont, and a stout, balding fellow in maester's robes who hovered nearby, listening intently. Brienne joined them, removing her helmet and setting it aside. A few other advisors lingered in the background, including a tall, stern-faced woman wearing House Mormont's sigil, presumably kin to Lyanna Mormont. Jon turned to Gendry, Edric, and Maya. "Tell us everything you can. How large was the Dead's host? Did they have any monstrous creatures with them? Ice spiders, undead bears, wights of giants?" Gendry swallowed. "We saw no giant wights or ice spiders. But the Night King rode some pale creature, or maybe he just appeared on the battlements. It was dark and everything happened fast. The courtyard was flooded with wights in minutes." Maya nodded in grim agreement. "It felt like they tore down the gates effortlessly. We had torches, but it didn't slow them. There were only a handful of defenders. Storm's End wasn't prepared for such an assault. And then the walls themselves iced over. Some sort of magic." Sansa's face turned pale, and she exchanged a glance with Jon. Ser Jorah stroked his beard thoughtfully, his eyes clouded with worry. "If the White Walkers are able to raise the temperature of the wind, freeze gates and ramparts, that's a new level of sorcery." Edric leaned forward. A wave of cold swept through. Men froze where they stood. The next instant, they were screaming as wights tore them apart. "We heard the rumors before about Harhome and Eastwatch, about how the dead crashed in like a tide. But seeing it, he trailed off, memories too raw to describe." Jon folded his arms. "I'm sorry you had to witness that." His gaze hardened. "We've been fortifying Winterfell for months, stockpiling dragonglass from Dragonstone. We have some Valyrian steel blades, and Daenerys has her dragons. If the Night King tries to bring the same sorcery here, we'll do everything in our power to hold him off." Sansa's voice was steady, though her eyes gleamed with concern. "We've also reached out to every corner of the realm. Not everyone has answered, some are still entangled in southern power struggles, or they simply don't believe. But those who do believe, they're here." Brienne's lips thinned. "The question is, how soon might the Night King strike at Winterfell? We thought we'd have more time, that he was marching from the far north. But if he's attacked Storm's End, that means his forces move independently in multiple directions. He could be anywhere." Ser Jorah exhaled. "Daenerys is flying patrols with Drogon and Rhaegal to watch for the enemy's approach from the north, though it's a vast area to cover. If the Night King has already come this far south once, who's to say he can't appear again behind us?" A weighted silence followed. The threat felt closer than ever, pressing down on them. Finally, Jon looked at Gendry, Edric, and Maya. "You've come a long way. Get some rest, find hot meals, and settle among the defenders. We'll need every blade in the days to come, and your testimony will help rally the rest. No one can deny the truth of this threat once they hear how Storm's End fell." Gendry nodded, relief warring with dread. He realized his legs felt like lead, exhaustion threatening to buckle him at any moment. Edric and Maya looked equally spent, yet determined. They had reached the seat of House Stark. At least they'd achieved that much. Now the fate of the realm hung on what happened next. Maids ushered them to a suite of small chambers in the castle's keep, not far from the living quarters arranged for new arrivals of rank. The rooms were plain but warm, with simple wooden beds and shuttered windows. Gendry hardly remembered lying down. The moment his head touched the pillow, darkness claimed him. He dreamed of Storm's End again. Cold mist swirling through the courtyard, the walls coated in ice, dead eyes gleaming under flickering torchlight. He heard the Night King's shriek and felt the chill seizing his limbs. Yet in his dream, a bright flame cut through the cold. A dragon's roar, distant but fierce. He saw a flash of black scales and green eyes, or perhaps it was gold. Heat washed over him, melting the ice. He awoke in a sweat, heart pounding, unsure what was real. Outside, he heard the bustle of Winterfell's daily life, a far cry from the hush of the Stormlands. He rose, rubbed sleep from his eyes, and found Edric and Maya also stirring in adjacent rooms. They greeted each other with weary nods. Then they headed to the Great Hall, where they were offered bowls of thick porridge sweetened with honey. Tasted like the finest meal Gendry had ever had. They soon discovered Winterfell was a fortress in the midst of frantic preparation. Smithies rang with the sound of steel on steel. Armies of small folk carried barrels, hammered spikes, and sorted dragonglass arrowheads. Soldiers drilled in the courtyards, some wearing mismatched armor, others in partial furs. A sense of impending battle hung over everything, but it was a purposeful fear, not blind panic. They were expecting the worst and readying themselves to face it head-on. Gendry gravitated toward the forges, offering his smithing skill. He found rows of anvils set up, all manned by harried blacksmiths from across the north and beyond. Barrels of dragonglass shards were stacked nearby. Gendry introduced himself, and when he mentioned he had trained under Tobo Mott in King's Landing, they welcomed his help eagerly. Soon he was immersed in shaping arrowheads and spear tips. It felt familiar, comforting even. The ring of the hammer, the hiss of steel quenched in water, these were the sounds of creation in a world overshadowed by death. Maya spent time with the scouts, learning the lay of the land around Winterfell, offering her knowledge of Stormland terrain. Though the environment was wildly different in the north, her experience traveling on foot and scaling rocky cliffs could prove useful for any infiltration or sabotage missions. Meanwhile, Edric took the opportunity to spar with some of the northern warriors, learning the techniques they used for fighting whites: swift decapitation, dismemberment, employing dragonglass in close quarters. Edric's focus and earnest humility earned him respect among the soldiers, even if some eyed him warily for being a southern bastard with a storied father. By nightfall, they found themselves in the Great Hall again, along with many of the castle's inhabitants. Jon and Sansa presided from the high table, flanked by Brienne, Ser Jorah, and other key figures. Arya Stark appeared briefly, then slipped away as if too restless to sit still. Gendry noticed her scanning the hall, and he couldn't shake a flicker of familiarity, memories of an in long ago, of forging a helm in King's Landing, of traveling with the Brotherhood. But everything then had been so different. Rumors drifted through the air. A dragon had been seen flying east that morning, perhaps Daenerys scouting. Tormund Giantsbane and the wildlings were rumored to be patrolling the far northern ranges. The Vale Knights were expected soon, escorted by Robb and Arryn. Even a few Lannister men had defected north, acknowledging that the war for the living overshadowed all. Gendry recognized that for the first time in generations, the petty feuds of the realm were set aside by many, though not all, to face a menace that threatened every house, high and low alike. In the days that followed, Gendry lost himself in a routine of forging and repairs. Maya trained with scouts and rangers, occasionally vanishing for a day to map out vantage points or hidden approaches. Edric took on something like an officer's role among the new recruits, helping shape them into cohesive units, especially the refugees from the south. Brienne oversaw these efforts, sometimes pulling them aside to discuss strategy. Time may be short, she warned one cold afternoon as they conferred in the courtyard. We've no real notion of when the Night King will strike. A raven arrived this morning, sightings of whites near the last hearth. She paused, letting that sink in. The last hearth was the seat of House Umber, the northernmost major castle. If whites were there, it meant the enemy could be within striking distance in weeks, maybe days. We'll be ready, Edric said firmly. We have to be. Brienne nodded, though concern etched her brow. Keep drilling. Spread the word to stay near the walls at night. And keep your weapons close. As Gendry resumed his hammer work in the forges, a sense of urgency pulsed through every swing. He churned out dragonglass-tipped spears, grateful for the thick supply. Meanwhile, the nights grew colder, the wind howling across the battlements as if heralding the enemy's approach. On one such night, Gendry found himself alone in the forge after the others had retired. The furnace still glowed, embers flickering. He was shaping a dagger from a piece of Valyrian steel a northern lord had bequeathed for the war effort. The metal was ancient, folded countless times. It responded to his hammer blows in a way common steel never could. He'd never worked Valyrian steel before. Tobel Mott had refused to let an apprentice anywhere near such rare metal. But Gendry's skill had grown since then. Each strike felt purposeful, like he was forging a weapon that might one day save a life from the White's grasp. The door creaked open behind him. He turned to see Arya Stark, dressed in dark leathers, gliding into the glow of the forge. She regarded him with an inscrutable expression, eyes shining in the firelight. Gendry set down the hammer, wiping sweat from his brow. "You're working late," she observed quietly. He nodded, heart pounding for reasons he couldn't fully explain. "Still more weapons to make. We can never have enough." Arya stepped closer, examining the newly shaped blade. "Valyrian steel. Jon mentioned we had a few lumps of it left from melted down family swords or broken heirlooms. Figured we'd make daggers and short swords. He said you were skilled." Gendry shrugged. "I do what I can. It won't be a masterpiece, but it'll cut whites just fine." She studied him for a moment. The flicker of recognition passed between them again, echoes of an earlier time. Then she spoke softly. "I never thanked you. For helping me and the others back when we were just kids on the road. You could have left us a dozen times, but you didn't." He shook his head, a faint smile tugging his lips. "I didn't do much good then. Just followed the Brotherhood until they sold me to the Red Woman." A shadow crossed his face. "Some memories I'd rather forget." Arya's gaze hardened. "I know how that feels, having memories that burn in the dark. But we're here now, both of us. We have a chance to fight back. Not everyone gets that chance." He nodded, the words resonating with him. For a moment, they simply stood there, the hush of the forge wrapped around them. The only sound was the faint hiss of cooling metal and the crackle of dying coals. Her presence felt like a reminder of the world they had both come from, a world of struggle and desperation that, despite everything, had led them here to stand against a final darkness. "I'm glad you made it," Gendry finally said. "Truly." Arya offered a tiny smile. "Me too." Then she gestured to the blade. "Keep forging. We'll need every edge. And I'll see you in the morning. I'm training with the others in the yard." He watched her go, the door swinging shut behind her. His heart pounded in his ears. Slowly, he picked up the hammer again, turning back to the blade. He felt steadier somehow, as though that brief exchange had rooted him in this place. He hammered away, sparks showering, until the shape of a deadly dagger emerged, sharp and polished as the first rays of dawn. Morning light found Winterfell in a flurry of motion. A horn sounded from the walls, heralding the arrival of riders. Gendry stepped out of the forge to see the massive gates open, revealing a company of mounted knights wearing the sigil of the Vale, a swooping falcon over a moon. At their head rode Robin Arryn, looking a bit older but still pale and thin. His knights seemed more fearsome than he. With them rode Lord Royce, wearing heavy bronze armor etched with runes. The Vale had come, presumably answering the Starks' call to stand against the dead. As the knights clattered into the courtyard, Jon Snow and Sansa Stark descended to greet them. Gendry spotted Maya and Edric arriving as well, weaving through the gathered crowd. The Vale Knights dismounted, bowing stiffly. Lord Royce's booming voice carried, "We answer the summons of the king in the north. The Vale stands with you." Sansa greeted them politely, though Gendry saw tension in her jaw. Perhaps old wounds lingered from their dealings with Littlefinger. But that man was gone, so the rumors said, and the Vale was once again aligned with House Stark. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Over the next few days, more arrivals trickled in. A small force from the Reach, led by men loyal to House Tyrell's memory, though the Tyrells themselves were gone. A handful of Dothraki scouts appeared in the skies overhead, riding the dragons in shifts with Daenerys, or so the rumors claimed, though Gendry never caught more than glimpses of their silhouettes. Whispers spread that Daenerys herself was away on some urgent matter. Perhaps to speak with other southern lords or to try rallying any remaining houses. Or maybe to hunt for the Night King in the wilderness. No one knew for certain. All that was certain was that each day brought them closer to a confrontation they could not avoid. Amid this flurry, Gendry, Maya, and Edric found their roles further solidified. Maya joined several scouting missions into the frosty forests around Winterfell, searching for any sign of white incursions. She reported back with stories of strange footprints and disturbed graves, but no massed armies yet. Edric led drilling sessions, forging the southern refugees into cohesive spear lines, instructing them on how to hold rank against a relentless enemy. Gendry made weapons in a tireless cycle of forging and tempering, occasionally taking breaks to spar or help reinforce battlements with dragonglass spikes. One evening, Jon Snow summoned them to a council in the Great Hall. The atmosphere was somber as they gathered around a massive wooden table where maps of the North lay spread. Sansa, Arya, Lord Royce, Brienne, Ser Jorah, and several northern lords were present. Jon pointed to a region just north of Winterfell, an expanse leading toward the Last Hearth. Our scouts confirm the dead are close to the Last Hearth, Jon said grimly. We have two choices: meet them in open battle there, or fall back and lure them to Winterfell where our defenses are strongest. Either way, it's a risk. We have no guarantee the Night King won't try to bypass us entirely. Lord Royce stroked his beard. We'll lose many good men if we fight in the open, especially in this cold. But if we wait for them here, we risk them encircling us. Brienne frowned. A partial force could fortify the roads, slow the Night King, while the rest remain at Winterfell. Maya glanced at Gendry and Edric. We saw how quickly the dead overwhelmed Storm's End. Even the best fortifications might not hold, not unless we can bring dragons to bear. At that, Jon sighed, exchanging a look with Ser Jorah. Daenerys is en route. She sends word by Raven that she'll arrive soon. Until then, we can't rely on Dragonfire. Sansa folded her arms. We must assume the worst, that the dead can arrive here in less than a fortnight. Winterfell is as prepared as we can make it. Let us stand and fight here, rather than spread ourselves thin. The Last Hearth may already be lost. The debate continued, tensions rising as lords argued strategy. Eventually, a decision solidified: they would concentrate at Winterfell. Scouts and a vanguard of cavalry would ride to harass the approaching enemy, trying to slow its advance. But the main stand would be made behind Winterfell's walls. Gendry swallowed hard, remembering Storm's End. Would these walls fare any better against the Night King's magic? Jon sensed the unspoken question. As the council dispersed, he quietly approached Gendry, Edric, and Maya. "Thank you for all you've done," he said softly. "Your accounts of Storm's End have spurred us to greater caution. We're doubling the watch on the walls, reinforcing the gates with dragon steel reinforcements. I won't underestimate the Night King's power." Edric nodded. "All we can do now is wait and fight when they come." Jon laid a hand on Edric's shoulder. "It won't be easy. If any of you wish to stay behind the lines." "No," Maya interrupted, her voice firm. "We stand with the living. That's all there is to it." A tight smile flickered across Jon's face. "Then the North thanks you. May the gods protect us all." The days that followed were filled with final preparations. Nightfall arrived earlier and earlier, the sky cloaked in iron-gray clouds. Word spread that the vanguard had engaged small pockets of whites in the forests near the Umberlands, suffering losses but slowing the main column of the dead. Tension coiled tighter in the hearts of everyone at Winterfell. The walls bristled with sharpened stakes. The courtyard overflowed with anxious men, women, and even children, some armed with little more than sharpened sticks. On the eve of what they feared might be the Night King's arrival, Gendry stood atop the battlements, watching snow swirl in the torchlight. Beside him were Edric and Maya, all three gazing into the dark. Brienne moved along the walls, conferring with the men at each station. The flicker of torchlight revealed thousands of faces below, all bracing for what might come. Gendry couldn't help but recall the courtyard at Storm's End, the torches sputtering in the cold wind. A shiver coursed through him, but he steadied himself by gripping the stone parapet. This was different, he told himself. Here, they had an army prepared for this threat, not a handful of defenders caught unawares. Here, they had dragonglass by the cartload, walls layered in wards of fire, and allies from across the realm. If the dead attacked, they would face a unified host, not a single fortress of unsuspecting men. Yet the chill in the air felt the same as that night, a biting cold that carried a hint of doom. Gendry thought of the Night King, perched on some unseen vantage, eyes of blue flame. He exhaled a plume of breath. "We'll meet them soon," he murmured, voice scarcely above a whisper. Edric looked out over the plains where swirling snow obscured the horizon. Let them come. We've prepared all we can. Maya glanced at the two of them. No matter what happens, we fight together. We owe our father's memory that much and more. Gendry nodded, a swirl of emotions churning in his chest. The bastard children of Robert Baratheon, once scattered or ignored by the realm, now standing side by side on Winterfell's walls, allied with the Starks to defend the living. It felt surreal. He wondered if Robert would have ever imagined such a thing. Probably not, but life in these times was stranger than any dream. As the wind howled, they lingered there, three silhouettes against the storm, each bearing their own scars and hopes. The realm stood on the brink, threatened by a darkness older than any kingdom. But they were not alone in their stand. The forges glowed with fresh steel, the hearts of thousands burned with defiance, and somewhere overhead, dragons soared through the night sky, guardians of an age on the verge of extinction. Whatever came next would be a trial of fire and ice. But for the moment, they were ready, or as ready as mortal hearts could be. When dawn came, it brought only a lighter shade of gray to the sky. Scouts returned with urgent news: the enemy was near. The White Walkers advanced in cold silence, accompanied by a legion of whites that filled the roads, fields, and forests to the north. The time had come. Winterfell braced for siege, horns echoing across the ramparts. Soldiers took up positions on the walls, archers readied dragonglass arrows, cavalry lined up beyond the gates. The massive wooden doors groaned as they closed, iron bars sliding into place. The watchers on the battlements peered into the swirling snow, searching for the first glimpse of that pale, deathly host. Gendry stood among them, hammer resting at his feet, a dragonglass axe strapped to his belt. Edric and Maya flanked him, their faces set. Nearby, Brienne stood in full armor, sword in hand, the cloak of House Tarth flapping behind her. Farther along, Arya Stark crouched with a bow, eyes narrowed. Jon Snow could be seen at the far gate, conferring with Tormund Giantsbane, who had just ridden in with the battered vanguard. The tension was stifling. Then a cry went up from a watchman. Gendry followed his pointing arm. In the distance, the storm parted momentarily, revealing movement, shadows upon shadows, a churning mass of shapes. Even from here, Gendry felt the chill deepen. The wind carried a faint, keening sound that made the hairs on his neck stand up. He knew that sound well. He had heard it echo across the courtyard of Storm's End. Every archer knocked arrows. Every spearbearer gripped their weapon. Commands rang out. Gendry's heart thudded, and for an instant he flashed back to Storm's End's downfall. But he swallowed his fear and set his jaw. This time he was not alone. Thousands stood at his side, prepared for the long night's onslaught. The dead drew closer, their forms emerging from the white swirl. A host beyond counting, led by pale riders with glowing eyes. Somewhere above, a dragon roared. Fire lit the sky. The defenders of Winterfell let out a battle cry, the sound resonating across the plains. Gendry hefted his hammer, blood pounding in his ears. No turning back now. They had come all this way to stand as the living's shield, to avenge Storm's End, and to fight for dawn. As the enemy closed in, the first volley of flaming arrows arced through the air, painting streaks of orange against the iron-gray sky. The final battle for the living had begun. And in that moment, Gendry, Edric, and Maya, Robert Baratheon's bastards, stood resolute, ready to carve their place in the history of this war, forging hope from the embers of despair. They had fled the fall of Storm's End, braved the perils of the road, and now, shoulder to shoulder with the Starks, they would face the Night King's dread legion. The memory of all they lost burned in their hearts like a guiding flame, fueling their courage. In the distance came that piercing shriek once more. The lines surged, living versus dead, steel versus ice. The storm of death met the fortress of the living under the dark sky of winter, and the fate of Westeros hung in the balance.